Hello, and thank you for joining. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. My name is Elisa Zanola, and I'm Head of Events for the Fashion Scholarship Fund. As many of us are extremely familiar with Zoom at this point, there are some great features for you to utilize. One of them is the chat box. Feel free to send comments to the panelists. And there's also the Q&A box. As questions come to mind, we encourage you to submit them and we'll answer as many as possible during the Q&A segment of the session. And now I'd like to introduce our Executive Director, Peter Arnold.
Thanks, Elisa, for that introduction. Welcome everyone to our 8th week, the 8th Workforce Preparedness course in our 2021 FSF Summer Scholar Series. Can't quite believe it's been 8 weeks. Tonight's is themed FSF's Hard Look at Supply Chain. We're really excited. This is the 4th of our case study disciplines that we are introducing through this format. And I'm especially pleased that we are joined by our friend and supporter and partner this summer, SAP, and from SAP, Kristen Howell, who is the Global Vice President for Retail Solution Management at SAP and tonight's moderator. Welcome, Kristen. Kristen is joined by Angela Ray, who's the Director of CSR and Quality at Nordstrom Inc. Welcome, Angela. She's joined by Kimberly Smith, who's the Chief Supply Chain Officer at Everlane. Welcome, Kim. And we are also joined by Benjamin Plotkin, who's the 2021 FSF Scholar and top 4 finalists from Yeshiva University. Welcome, Ben. And finally, Marlena Meyer, who's the 2009 and 2010 finalist from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm happy to say, and I think she is the Manager of Analytics at First Dibs and the author of this year's case study prompt. So welcome to all of you. Kristen, I'm going to turn this over to your very capable moderating hands. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Peter. And hello, everybody. I'm very excited to talk supply chain tonight. And I thought maybe just to kind of get things rolling, why don't we hear just some brief introductions from Kim and Angela, kind of their background and their roles. So Kim, let's start with you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Kim Smith, and I'm the Chief Supply Chain Officer here at Everlane. I've been at the company for about 7 years, so most of our growth. And I've been in the industry for about 25 years, working for a variety of companies from Everlane, which is probably the smallest company I've ever worked for, and then to very large like Gap and Levi's. So I've done a whole bunch of different size of companies where I've been able to see a lot of different growth and structure and platform and process. I started in the industry, actually, I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon, which apparently I am not. And I went to school and studied sports medicine. So I had no idea about the fashion industry or apparel. And I went to go work for a bunch of doctors, and I decided that the medical industry had changed pretty dramatically from what I thought it was, and I wasn't super inspired. And part of me always had a creative side. So I had a very mathematical sort of ops side to me, but there was also this creative side to me that was very pulling me into the direction of fashion. And I started in the mailroom, actually. I applied for a job in a newspaper. This is before the internet. And I applied to a job. I started in the mailroom, which is actually where I started kind of learning about freight. And then I went into product development and I became very product focused. And then I've sort of expanded my career from there. So, started making minimum wage, and I'd say I'm probably the prime example of climbing the corporate ladder from the very, very bottom where I was packing boxes all the way to now a C-suite and a growing company. So anything is possible. And yeah, so that's kind of been my journey so far. And what I manage now at Everlane is a pretty wide scope. Everlane's structure is a little bit different to maybe some other companies. We don't have a chief operating officer here, so I'm a little bit of a chief operating officer and a chief supply chain officer. So I manage raw materials sourcing and production and strategy. I manage tech design. I manage product development. I manage all of sourcing and production. I manage quality control. I manage sustainability for the entire company. And I also manage our inbound, our distribution center, and our outbound freight. So pretty much when you think of anything that makes the product or moves the product falls under my team. And I have a team of about 30 currently.
Great, thank you, Kim. And maybe over to you, Angela, to give a little bit of your background.
I'm hoping my connection is good. Let me introduce myself. I'm Angela Ray. I have been at Nordstrom for the last 15 years. Before that, I worked I started my career in a factory, working in a sweater factory, one of the last sweater manufacturers in the United States, I think. Moving on to a lower price point tier of a company called Shopgo Stores, where I was the first trend and designer on staff. I have a design background, so I moved to Seattle and started on the design team at Nordstrom in high-end bridge price points. Then I also have a minor in pattern making, so I moved on to managing the technical design area, and as well as the product development area after that, sourcing and costing. Then moving on to sourcing for selecting all of our factories and making sure that we're responsibly manufacturing. Then most recently, I've been the lead on our CSR and our quality area at Nordstrom. And having been in all of those different areas of the business, it's been really interesting to see how the industry has evolved over the many years that I've been in the apparel industry. We currently have a lot of corporate social responsibility goals, and without having the knowledge of all of those different areas and supporting each of those areas, I don't believe I could do as good of a job in the CSR areas I'm trying to do today. Everything is connected, and the industry is changing so much, and having the ability of one team to know what the other team is doing and having aligned goals is really something that I am seeing being really important to achieving some of the goals that we need to set for organizations like Nordstrom. Right now, I'm going to talk a little bit about our CSR goals because it leads into a lot of the supply chain needs. And there's a couple of goals that I wanted you to make sure you are aware of. The women's empowerment goal that we set for ourselves is to achieve 90% of Nordstrom made product in women's empowerment factories. And the second goal that we've set for ourselves is traceability, to disclose traceability of 90% of our Nordstrom made factories to our customer. And then the third goal that I wanted to share with you is our raw materials sustainability goal, and that's to set 50% of our Nordstrom made products made from primarily cotton, recycled, or cellulosic fibers. So the reason I'm telling you that is because they all connect together, and in order for a supply chain to be solid, as we're moving forward, those pieces have to talk to each other, and your sourcing strategy should be based around the goals that you're trying to achieve. And that links to your ability for all of these things to connect in real time so that you can make good decisions throughout your supply chain. So that's a little background about me. It's what I'm focused on most recently. I know we're going to get into a little bit more around how things connect as we continue on.
Yeah, and Angela, it's kind of a great transition point, because maybe you could start with this thought around how you strike a balance with competing priorities, and then ultimately how, from a supply chain perspective, you think about managing disruption. Because as the students on the call know, the case study prompt this year is really all about, finding resilience but being able to kind of balance against, different priorities and a lot of the disruptions. Very real world, right? We've kind of been living in a world of disruption. So maybe that's a great place to start, Angela. Some of your background from a Nordstrom perspective, what have you learned about balancing these disruptions? What have you seen? Any best practices that you could share with the group?
Sure. So I think we all experienced quite the past 2 years with COVID, and the disruption that that has caused on the supply chain has been enormous for all retailers. It's actually been a real wake-up call for us at Nordstrom, if I'm honest. When COVID first hit, there were a lot of things that started having a snowball effect. So our factories, we shut down on our side for about 5 weeks at Nordstrom. We shut down all of our stores. And it set off a trigger effect of if things were in the supply chain, they were at all different parts of the process. So there were things that were in raw material stage. There were things that were on the line in the sewing stage overseas in the factories, and there were things that were on the water. When we shut down, all of that stuff triggered. So what ended up happening is we really identified the need for being able to see things in real time, clearly, from the very beginning of production to the very beginning or the very end of delivery to the stores, in order to do the right thing for the factories and stop production where it was at, making sure that they were getting paid on time and that the factory workers were clearly notified of what was happening so they could benefit from knowing what needed to happen next. It was a real eye opener. So when it comes to the supply chain, having clear visibility has been really something that we identified at Nordstrom as a need as we move forward.
Great. And Kim, anything to add from your perspective regarding disruptions and managing through that change?
Yeah, definitely. This last 2 years has been quite unique, and I will say extremely challenging. Supply chain, when a window closes, another one opens, and you are definitely, the one thing that comes out of this type of disruption is innovation and technology, and how that can play a role in supply chain and anything we're doing. So I think what was really helpful for us, first of all, was to react very quickly. As soon as we heard about potential shutdowns across the globe and retail, et cetera, we tried to react extremely quickly so that we would have the ability to be flexible and nimble. And that was like the day we heard of it, reacting immediately was very, very important. The second thing was to really look at our processes to see where we could automate and use technology and be really innovative that way. So for example, looking at robotics in our warehouse, looking at digital technology and 3D technology from a technical design perspective, looking at our product and seeing, hey, how is the customer going to change in the demand of what they want, whether that's the type of product, the service they need. All of a sudden, we are very heavy direct to consumer, whereas obviously the retail industry and all the retailers were hit very hard. We happen to be very fortunate to be very heavy direct to consumer, so we had a little bit of an advantage there, but still, like, the product was completely different. No one wanted denim, wovens, anything that wasn't comfortable. And that was 50% of our business. So we had to be able to flex really quickly on the product. The other thing I would say is, what Angela also spoke to is about working with our factories and being able to completely support them and have them be in a safe environment. And, if they had to close down, how do we support them and keep things going and paying them for what was in line, even if they couldn't ship it. So really sitting with each CEO, we called every single CEO, my CEO and myself called every single CEO that was, our factory CTOs sat down with them and went through the plan and went through every single potential problem and how we were going to support each other. And so that each team could really plan on each other and work together as a partnership. And we thought that was really important. And then obviously the safety of all of our workers, whether that's our factory workers, our employees, our retail staff, was really, really important. That was the number one most important thing. So making sure that we were taking extra precautions on all parts of the supply chain, our DC, you name it, to make sure that they were safe and felt protected and had a contingency plan if something were to happen, like there was a shutdown or someone got sick, to make sure that that was really top of mind in everything we did.
And Kim, you raise a really interesting point about not only were there disruptions from a kind of core supply chain perspective, but your consumer was changing as well in terms of what that direct to consumer model looked like and how your consumer really had different expectations. And I'm curious, maybe Angela, did you see that from a Nordstrom perspective, or how did that customer engagement aspect really impact what you were doing from a supply chain perspective?
Yeah, we've been talking about it for some time, but really what we see the industry changing as is to be more direct to consumer, and being able to shorten your lead time as tight as you can so that you can deliver on demand what the customer is asking for. Ideally, if we could do made to measure based on the customer's request, that's what we'd like to see the majority of our business moving towards in the future. The tighter we can get that, the more we'll be able to deliver on exactly what the customer wants, with reducing the waste in the environment and shipping in excess inventory, replenishment. All of that is a sign of the past.
And Kim, you mentioned you guys are primarily direct to consumer. Did you see any significant changes or any examples you could offer about that direct to consumer interaction with some of the core supply chain needs that you had?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different stages and how it's evolved. I think originally the biggest change was on the getting to people's homes. Originally just working with FedEx, we were a big partner with FedEx. The complete parcel movement supply chain was completely disrupted, with the Amazons of the world and everyone all of a sudden shipping to their homes versus bulk shipping or shipping to urban markets. It was all residential. And that was a really big, massive hit to the supply chain. It dramatically hit all suppliers and carriers, and still is. The volume that FedEx saw was something they were expecting 5 to 10 years out that they saw in 2020. So that was a big change. I think from a product perspective, the ability to be nimble and to move inventory quickly is definitely something, as I mentioned before, like the actual product was completely different. All of our woven stopped selling 100%. Like it was all knits and sweaters and leggings, and people wanted to, be comfortable and casual. What's now changing, and even though we're still in COVID, actually pretty heavily in COVID, is now they want the wovens back, and they're kind of want to dress up more now, and people are looking to look put together, and they're kind of sick of wearing sweats all day. So now that's completely changed again. So it's been very hard to forecast. So to point, Angela's point of how do you be tight on inventory and less wasteful, but still service what the customer needs is the trick of it all. And then I think part of that is speed, right? So how do you be able to react quickly and still have, being conscious of sustainability. Obviously that's a big part of who we are at Everlane. And whether that's, re-commerce, or it's using old liabilities and coming up with new ideas that maybe were created from COVID, Or is it just a totally different way of operating go forward? Like I mentioned, we took on 3D technology. That was something that we had to take on very quickly. We started using robots in our DC, and we implemented that right before peak, which was very unusual and very risky. So there were things that we kind of took a leap that, which I mentioned, in time of disruption, innovation and technology really does come out and lead. And that we really felt that this year, which was really exciting to be a part of. And I think our factories have also really thought about that. It's like, how did they implement technology and innovation and how they work, knowing that maybe they were very reliant on people, and how do they, have to now have separation and have 6 social distancing and still have the same output, is really important to figure out how to do it sustainably and also safely. So I think that was a big change for us. Now I got distracted on the question. Sorry, I'm rambling, but I think that there's been so many things, and honestly, we're still learning every day. I mean, I don't know if you're aware, but the rest of the world is actually closing down. The US is in a very different situation than the rest of the world. So we're still very in this and living through it every day. So we're continuing to evolve and learn as we speak. I'm right in the middle of it right now. I don't know about you, Angela, but I'm definitely right in the middle of current disruptions and trying to figure out ways around it. But I think from a supply chain perspective is also the balance of where you put your production, your vendors you're working with, not having all your eggs in one basket. We got hit pretty hard with some factory closures, and it hurt our business pretty heavily. And so we're rethinking, sort of where we're working, how much is in one vendor, how much is in one country. If a whole country locks down, which we have also been through, you're in trouble, like if you have a lot of vendors there. So we're really looking at our balance and making sure that we have a stable structure, but also not just from a factory level, but from a country level.
Yeah, and I like where you're going in terms of using technology, right? Obviously, from SAP in the technology business, we saw a lot of retailers and global brands really shift their innovation strategies very quickly and start implementing technology to help overcome some of the challenges with disruption. And I'm curious, Angela, if you have seen kind of similar trends as Kim in terms of implementing technology, or anything that Nordstrom did kind of quickly to pivot and adapt and be flexible?
Yeah, we're going through the same thing that Everlane is right now. Someone said to me recently, don't waste a good pandemic. And that couldn't be more than true right now. I think to Kim's point about innovation, there's so much happening right now. And the more you can shorten your lead times, the more you can stop and fix the problem, and listen to people that are closest to doing the work right now is the best way to solve. We're finding that we're having to analyze our inventory daily and where it is in the pipeline, and having real-time visibility is completely invaluable right now. Having to shift, like Kim was saying, based on the country of origin, every week we're hearing different concerns from different countries. So I can give you an example. Over the last month, India flared really drastically on the closures and the concerns that they were having around COVID. And then they seemed to get their arms around it, and then it flared back up again. So like you're having to shift with the shifting tides, and being flexible is really what you need to do.
Yeah, and I know our time is running out. Maybe I'll close with one last question for the both of you. So for the students working on their case study prompts, when you think about supply chain, balancing disruption, all the kind of challenges and solutions that we've just discussed, what do you see really as kind of the main, criteria for success? How do you measure success? What do your KPIs really look like? How do you know you've done a good job and, found the right balance? And and are really focused in the right areas from a supply chain perspective? Maybe Kim, we'll start with you.
I think the first thing is partners, and the partners you choose to work with is really important. Making sure you're with the right partners and it is a true partnership, and it is a two-way street. Unfortunately, a lot of this industry is about the brands, and it's always the brand in control. I think really having that true partnership with your suppliers and that you are equal and work together is really critical. I think the other thing from a KPI perspective is, as I mentioned before, and I think Angela alluded to this, is just having balance and not all your eggs in one basket, and really being creative in how you think about that. You know, we actually started working in the US and thinking about, hey, do we need to be back in the domestic part of the world? And how do we balance that out? So that if something, you know, we're still in this, we're still trying to figure out it all. So I think there's the balance piece of it. It's not all about cost, it's about a variety of things, and there's a lot of people in this process. And so how do you protect people, protect your margin, and still deliver the right product is really something to think about. And then obviously being flexible. You know, if you have too much inventory, I worked at the Gap, and Mickey Drexler used to say, like, inventory is money on the shelf. So being able to really manage your inventory well, being nimble and quick, being able to service a customer, whether it is the made to measure or customizing, it's definitely something to think about. We haven't gone down that road yet, but it's definitely something to think about when you look at waste and speed and inventory management. For sure, is something to think about. So those are the things that I would say are important. I think for sure having the right partnerships are the number one most important thing, in my opinion.
Great. And what about you, Angela? How do you think about measuring success at Nordstrom?
I agree with your partnership statement for sure. It's what's kept Nordstrom around for over 120 years. Definitely around KPIs, we listen to our customer. Our customer tells us what our priorities are. And if we're not delivering on what the customer needs, we're not here tomorrow. So we have to listen to them first and foremost. And then I think it's about storytelling. It's making sure that everyone understands the goals and we're aligned on the goals, whether it's your partners, whether it's your internal team, whether it's your external team, making sure that everyone knows what our goals are and that we're constantly measuring them and measuring them visually so that it really sticks with you as to how we're doing. And the customer tells us daily. They tell us what they like, what they don't like. It's so easy nowadays for the customer to tell you what they need, and you can get it directly from them. So for Nordstrom, the reason we're here and the thing that we do best is serve our customer, and that's what guides us always with our KPIs.
Great. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Kim. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. And now I'm going to turn it back to you, Elisa, for the next portion.
Great. I'll share my screen now, and we will dive into the presentation segment of the session led by Marlena and Benjamin.
Thank you. And so as the screen is booting up, I'll just say that what Benjamin and I are going to do now is I think you guys have gotten a very, very good sense from Angela, Kristen, and Kim around how timely, how relevant, and how important the sort of subject of this case is to today's retailers and brands. What we're going to do now is really from the perspective of a case author and judge, and from the perspective of somebody who's done an absolutely incredible job with one of our past supply chain cases. What is sort of some advice that we can give you to really maximize and really be able to feel prepared to tackle this year's prompt. And so with that, we're going to start off by just giving you a broad overview of what we're actually asking you to do. So like was sort of alluded to earlier, this year's case objective is really to think through how you can mitigate future inventory risk by really maximizing agility, both within your distribution network and really across your entire supply chain. And so This year, what we're asking you to do is to pick a existing mono brand or retailer of your choice. And this can be either fashion, footwear, beauty, accessories, home, health, and wellness across sort of many industries. But what is important is that this is a mono brand, meaning that it is not a retailer like Nordstrom. It is instead a mono brand like Everlane. The reason that we ask for that is really to ensure consistency across cases. And it's definitely one of the questions that we sort of get asked the most. In addition to whether or not the company necessarily has to be public. And so what you'll notice when reading through a prompt is that we this year have not made it mandatory that you work with a public company. However, one sort of piece of advice that I would give you if you're thinking about specifically tackling supply chain is that given that this case, as you'll sort of find out, is so heavily focused on thinking through really specific tactical strategy, as well as really being thoughtful around operating expense, margins, and sort of revenue flow, that it sort of is in your best interest to choose a company that you can really dive into and understand a lot about. And so with that, while you don't necessarily have to, I surely encourage you to pick a company that is publicly traded that you can really understand very deeply. And so with that, I'll just kind of give you a brief overview. Benjamin and I will kind of dive through each of these 5 points, or we talk to each one of them. But basically the expected deliverables for the case is to first and foremost, think through how you potentially update your chosen company's existing footprint. And that includes really any point of distribution, whether it's wholesale, company-owned formats, or direct-to-consumer, and really think about how you would evolve that in order to enable flexibility. We'll then ask you to think through how you would really define an investment strategy and sort of how you would fund your plan. And so like Kim mentioned, while it's not necessarily always all about cost, particularly for this case, we do want you to be thoughtful around whether or not this is something that potentially could be self-funded within margin savings that might be out there. Next section will really focus around flexibility across the entire supply chain, so both on the supply and demand side. And there we'll talk a little bit about how to really define a very actionable execution plan, prioritize milestones, and sort of complete that cost and risk analysis in order to prioritize them accordingly. So with that, what I will sort of start off with is the first point on here, which is really defining your footprint strategy. And so before I actually dive into the specifics around this year's case, a few sort of general pieces of advice. So the way that we think about this and sort of some of the best cases are ones where you really put yourself in the seat of a COO or a chief supply chain officer and think through really at a broad level what you want to tackle. So you, particularly for supply chain, and unlike some of our other case problems like design, really what we value a lot here is not necessarily creativity in the traditional sense. So your strategy doesn't necessarily need to be very out there, sort of completely unexpected, but rather what's very important is that you are very thoughtful around picking a specific problem and then being thoughtful around how to solve it in a way that is actionable and really makes sense for the company that you chose. And sort of last quick note on that is, I think through even listening to this presentation, I'm sure you've gotten many different ideas around what sort of are all the different things that you can kind of think of to potentially answer this question. What's very important is as you're kind of thinking through what your strategy is to be thorough with your research. And I would say one of my biggest pet peeves as a case judge is when scholars throw out an idea without necessarily acknowledging whether or not a retailer or a company has tried it before, and particularly bad if you don't acknowledge a place where someone has tried it and potentially has course corrected or hasn't worked. If that is the case, you want to really be very forthcoming about your research. And again, the goal is not necessarily to think through a strategy that's completely brand new, since that will potentially be difficult to do within this specific sort of prompt, but rather one that really makes sense for the company that you've chosen. And so to tie this up before I hand it over to Benjamin to talk through the investment and sort of funding piece, for this year's case study, what we really want you guys to think about as it relates to flexibility within your footprint is really thinking about inventory risk, both in terms of underages, so situations in which you are having a tough time fulfilling orders given some of your downstream supply chain disruptions, as well as more of the sort of underage risks. So potential situations in which you have too much inventory and sort of need to liquidate it. So with that in mind, your mission is going to take inventory, no pun intended, of all of your different existing distribution channels, and think about whether or not there's any places in which you would either develop and expand or potentially close down and really shift how your product is currently being sold out in the marketplace. And so with that, unless there's anything to add from other folks, I'm kind of move it over to investment and funding.
And just to give you a sense, so I was a scholar last year on supply chain. So I guess I'll give you my perspective on how I went about, solving the problems, the different challenges, and just the way that I thought about, constructing my project and the different steps that I took. So just to begin, I'm a graduate from Yeshiva University. I majored in strategy and entrepreneurship and had some computer science as well. So I know background to supply chain. Like I didn't know too much about supply chain, and I took this as an opportunity to learn. And I think that's one of the greatest parts about this, this case study is it gives you such a great lens to research, to gain a new perspective, and to deeper understand the different problems and potential solutions that are out there. So I took this as a great opportunity to do so. And what I came across was the incredible amount of research you could find online about companies. And just to reiterate, I think that's why it would be a really good idea to take a publicly traded company, because a publicly traded company, you'll have, a lot more different pieces of information you could gather to help validate your proposal and your solution. So I would definitely go for a publicly traded company. One interesting thing to note, though, which is what the approach that I took, is I didn't choose a company to begin with. What I first did, which we'll get into, is what's your approach? What's your strategy, right? How are you going to create a more flexible supply chain and the different investments, technologies that are necessary depending on the current supply chain infrastructure that you have, right? So what does it look like? Is it solely direct to consumer? What's your distribution centers kind of formatted like? And based on these different variables will help kind of figure out, okay, this is the approach I'm going to take. And then what I did was I kind of looked for companies that were best suited for implementing that strategy. And by doing so, it kind of gave me a better understanding of, okay, this could be better implemented by this brand as opposed to that brand. And that's why I came across, Champion, which is, you can see a couple of these slides were some of the slides that I put together. So when you're thinking about, this is my approach that I want to take, this is the strategy that I want to implement to create a more flexible supply chain. There's a lot of information and data points that you got to gather. And the biggest thing is you don't want to throw out random numbers out there without actually validating those numbers, right? You want to put something together that actually makes reasonable sense, that was thought through, and that has kind of these different metrics that kind of add up together to kind of form one cohesive piece. So how do you get there? So for me, annual reports are great, quarterly reports, projections, and validating projections, right? That can include just the company in general, what people are projecting for that and why they're projecting it, but then also the industry as a whole. So just to give you kind of an insight into what I did for last year's case, just the way that I was thinking was I had, 3-year projection plan. And what I did was I found online was that these are the basic amount of revenue that was generated through direct-to-consumer channels, because I couldn't find just the direct-to-consumer revenue on the actual quarterly reports. I was finding just the general revenue for the company as a whole. So how did I get to that number, right? So I looked up average order value, and I kind of calculated based on this average order value, based on these net revenues, they got this many orders. And I kind of broke it down by different variables and different pieces that kind of come up with one cohesive idea of, okay, this is how they're getting to these numbers, and this is how I'm going to bring these numbers to validate those numbers. And that's what it's about. It's about asking yourself questions, continuing to ask more and more questions. And by doing so, you're kind of build this structure for yourself where, this proves this and this proves that. And I think the biggest thing for me when going about it was there's so many times where you can say, this is enough. I don't need to validate this idea anymore. I think this is a good enough, good enough presentation. But really, if you push yourself to say, no, I know I could add this. I know I could research this. I know I'm not incorporating this part, which I should incorporate, and you really push yourself to keep on refining your project. One, you'll put together a project you're really, really proud of, which will be a testament to your hard work. And two, it'll really show you, how deep you could really get with just understanding logistics and components involved with supply chains. And I think it's really beneficial. So over here, you're going to define your investments, right? What type of technologies, what type of adjustments you're making towards your current, supply chain infrastructure, and then what kind of money and funding are you needed in order to, actually go through with that. So these are all different, metrics and numbers for revenue, for example, that you need to take into account. But one interesting thing, which I wasn't really taking into account so much, which Kim and Angela mentioned, was it's not just about money, right? It's about the people as well. And I think that's like a really interesting point. So you're going to think about all these variables, all these costs, but really, what is the company going to do to actually implement your idea? It has to be something that's, that's humane, that's good, that people want to do in order to consider all the different variables involved. So I think that's like to, really think about as well. Yeah, and then I guess, Marlena, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think I'll sort of keep on going through with the second component of the case. So the first one being the footprint and the distribution network, and second one being more sort of holistically tackling how you can enable flexibility across both supplier brand and brand consumer nodes. And so on this point, the one piece that I want to sort of highlight for you guys, and one sort of big piece of advice would be that here we very specifically ask you about what should be the top 3 most impactful levers. And so something that I sort of love that Benjamin just said around sort of really thinking, is this enough? And kind of continually to pushing yourself to refine and edit. One piece that kind of comes along with that is you want to ensure that ultimately your case isn't sort of a mile-long list of tiny sort of little slivers of ideas, that instead you really flesh through and think about, where am I going to get sort of the most impact? How have I validated sort of why is it these 3 and sort of not other 3? And really, while all of that research and all of that backup is really important, ultimately, one of the things that's going to also make you stand out is your ability to be able to be very clear and really, sort of concise in, like if you take a look at this one of Benjamin's slides, it's sort of so clear what sort of he chose here out of the 3 options and what the backup of it is. So being able to both be able to have very thorough research, but ultimately pull it back up. And maybe the example I'll kind of give from the panel before is the last question that was asked. Both Angela and Kim were able to really just give that sort of one answer. And ultimately, while there's so many different ideas out there, being able to really prioritize and hone in on what is most important is going to be a piece that's going to be very important to really separate good cases from the best cases. And so on that note, we'll kind of finish it back up with the execution plan and actual prioritization, unless Benjamin, you want sort of to add anything on the top right side here.
I think that was great. We could you continue. Okay, cool. So yeah, so then you have to define your execution plan. Just reflecting on what I did last year for my cases, I kind of proposed different phases of implementation of my idea, right? So it's not going to just all happen at once. There has to be an actual execution of how we're going to get through with actually implementing this idea. A lot of the execution plan involves the different metrics, right? So what's the cost for the technologies that are necessary? This is how much I think we need to invest in order to do so accordingly and get it done efficiently. But then not only are we going to get it done efficiently, but we actually have to figure out according to what timeline, right? And that's also going to take into account your current supply chain. How is it actually formatted? What are we going to need to do with our current infrastructure in order to make sure that by this time, it's working this way? Is there a way for us to implement an effective strategy where just right off the bat, over the first couple of stages, we're actually creating an effective tool for creating more flexibility, right? Because flexibility doesn't just necessarily need to come at once, but maybe over the course of time, it'll come through these different phases and steps that you implement. And those steps are going to need to take into account the different, costs and variables involved. So you want to measure probability, like what's the probability of this happening that'll impact our supply chain. So we're going to make these steps in order to take into account the different risks involved. Because that's one of the biggest things, is using data-oriented approaches to mitigate risks and make effective, smart decisions. And then I guess we could follow up with the next slide, unless Marlena, you have anything else to add? Which is, just to prioritize the milestones, right? So these are the steps that we're going to take. And I think this is one of the biggest things that I'd say for myself when putting together my case. You don't want to get stuck on, this is this slide that I put together, it covers this information. This is that slide that covers that information. I'd say keep the entire project open for change throughout the entire process, because you take in more information, as you take in, broadening your perspective of different approaches, you're going to want to, make adjustments through the slides that kind of create one cohesive piece. I actually didn't write my overall executive summary until the last very slide. That was until I had everything put together, all my strategy put together. That's when I put my executive summary together, because you want to be open-minded with this. You might know a lot about supply chain already, but this is a great opportunity for you to just challenge yourself and come up with new creative approaches and overall just ways of thinking about it in order to come up with your plan. So when you prioritize your milestones, you're going to take into account the different costs and benefits of, this step, we're going to implement this, but what are the costs of actually doing so? What are the costs of creating that flexibility in order to effectively implement it into our supply chain? So I wish you all luck. I personally just want to say it's such a pleasure to be involved with this community, the FSF. And for me, as a previous scholar, to all of you looking forward to applying, I really recommend you put in the efforts to apply, because one, it'll help you learn a lot, but two, this is an incredible community of people to be involved with.
Thanks, Ben. And thanks, Marlena, for walking us through that. It was super helpful. There have been a number of questions that have come in that I'll probably address to specific presenters. A quick one, I think, Marlena, that you can dispense with from Jennifer. What about a company like Woolmark? Would that qualify as a valid mono brand? Marlena, you want to answer that one?
I would just say yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. This question, I think I'm going to throw to you, Kim. This is from Paivon. Do you see a future in which the definition of cost is rewritten in a way that entails the true cost of making products sustainably and communicating to the customers the process in a transparent way?
I do. Everline is known for our transparency and cost, and we're actually constantly re-looking at that and how we can be even more transparent. Originally, we did not build in sustainability costs into this. It's truly about the product and how you make it. It's not about all the other things. Even the logistics cost is not truly built in. And that's something that we're re-looking at, is like what about reverse logistics and all the things that we, in D2C, there's a lot of returns, which is what I'm sure a lot of retailers are feeling right now that maybe they weren't privy to, because when you have retail and you go in person, you have a lot less returns. But now with D2C, there's a lot more returns that we've always had. And so that is part of sustainability too, right? It's like you ship something out and it comes all the way back, and then you have to restock it. And maybe it's damaged out because someone tried it on and got lipstick on it or something. So there's a whole world of the reverse logistics piece that is tied to sustainability and cost that I'd say also needs to be built in. And I think we're relooking at how do we communicate that to the customer, and they understand, like, hey, there's a huge part of that is not built in right now. And I do think it is the future.
Nice. Thanks, Kim. Angela, I think I'm going to throw this one to you from Benjamin Yao. Thank you to all the panelists for speaking today. My question is about being able to identify quality producers and providers. Do they more often come from recommendation or by cold searching? How does one best maintain a producer-distributor relationship? Any key mistakes to avoid? And Kim, feel free to chime in, but I'm throwing this one to Angela.
We have a number of ways to get new suppliers. One of the best ways to get a new supplier is to work with some of your retail peers. Nowadays, everyone shares their supplier list through their website typically, and by using some of your retail peers and having constant conversations with them, they can tell you who their best suppliers are, and most likely they're willing to share if you're working as a team. I would say though that our best suppliers are the ones that we've worked with over the years and that we've invested time and money into and worked with special projects with them on. We've been with some of our suppliers for over 20 years, and to Kimberly's point earlier, your best relationships are what really progress you forward, and working as a team is what really makes those relationships last.
Great. Thanks for that, Angela. This from an anonymous questioner to either of you or both. What post-COVID consumer need changes on the product side do you feel will actually remain? You guys mentioned, changing and shifting, but are there ones that have developed that you think will stay? Angela, you're nodding, so I'm going to ask you to unmute and answer that one.
Well, a lot of what we're finding is the reduction in waste. Kim had mentioned it earlier about 3D, where we can work with our teams to reduce a lot of the speed and the waste of making product, sending it back and forth for fits. All of that combined is what will stick. Those are the things that are making us more efficient, bringing us closer to the customer's needs, and reducing the costs in the supply chain.
Great. You both touched on this. This is from Kevin. To increase speed and efficiency, what links in the supply chain do you view as an opportunity to move stateside?
I can jump on that one. I'm not sure what they mean by links, but I think there is a couple things. I think there is the ability to chase quickly is going to, I think there's a variety of things. There's politics, which we don't need to get into today, but the political part of it. But there is also the challenges from a freight and logistics piece. I don't see going away for a good probably year. And that we will need to rely on more domestic production. I think there is the speed. We talked about inventory, being able to react quickly to whether that's trends or being sold out or delays will definitely be pushing more information on and more production on the US domestic piece so that you can balance your inventory smartly. But it does come with the cost. And so how do you balance out your margins with speed? And that's always the big challenge, right? It's the cheapest is usually the farthest away. So how do you, but it's always the longest. So like, how do you balance out speed and margin and inventory is the trick of supply chain. And I think we all, I'm sure Benjamin worked through this with his project. It's, the combination of innovation, automation, partnerships, and margin, and also great product. And you can't forget about the product because the product has to be great. So, and your customer needs to react to it. So there is a balance of all of those things, but I definitely think there will be a push to more domestic production in certain I don't know about all categories, but in certain categories.
Angela, anything you want to add to that?
Just that the politics do play a big piece in this, just because companies have if you're going to start production or expand production in the States, a lot of the equipment is no longer available in the States or close to Western Hemisphere. So it's a big investment for a factory to start up production in this region again. So the politics and the long-term strategy of it is really going to be effective in the big scheme of things.
Got it. Kim, you talked about pivoting quickly to robotics. Here's a question. How does the size of the business affect its ability in adapting new ways of doing things, such as adopting new technology?
Yeah, I think it's challenging because of cost. So, we're a smaller company. We definitely have run a lower margin than other retailers, but we really pivoted to balancing innovation and technology into our costs. But I think looking at, you don't have to have the best of the best, the most expensive thing. There are a lot of new things coming out that are more affordable, whether that's software, where it's like a combination of robotics. Obviously you're competing with the Amazons of the world that own their own technology and software, but there's a lot of great things out there that can really help you be faster, smarter, have more transparency and visibility, and they don't need to cost a fortune, but it does require some research and probably a lot of talking to different people to make sure it's the right thing for you at the right time. It really depends, like how fast are you growing? What's your capital? Like finding that perfect balance. So doing the research is going to be really important.
Got it. Angela, you mentioned not letting a good pandemic opportunity pass one by. Any examples of product or supply chain related innovations or achievements that came out of the pandemic for you and for Nordstrom?
Yeah, as a company, we've always been customer facing, and all of our investments really get made on the customer front. So it's really highlighted for our development teams and back of house how critical having that connection point of the start of product to the results of the product and connecting that all together through data analytics is really becoming in the industry. And we've been on a lot of calls lately with industry experts, and those companies that have the capability to do that over the next 5 years are the ones that are going to stick around. So if it's done anything for the product development team, the pandemic that is, it's really highlighted for us the need of the real-time end-to-end data that's needed.
Nice. Thanks for that, Angela. We've got time for one quick, I promise, rapid fire question with rapid fire answers. Ben, I'm sorry, this one is for what advice you give your younger self. So I'm not sure where you're going to take us with that answer. But Kim, I'm going to start with you. Interning for a doctor or in the mailroom, just advice back to that woman who was doing those things and where you are now and your journey. Any advice to our audience, which really are young students, applicants for scholarships, as well as young alumni?
Yeah, so I had zero experience and I had no background in this field, and I'd say the secret to my success is to ask a lot of questions, listen, and try a lot of different things, because you may think you want one thing, but there's like a whole nother world out there. And so I'm known for asking a lot of questions, and they can be very annoying, but that's how I've learned on the job. And there is no thing as a stupid question. And I think to have a low ego is also very important, that you're listening and that every single person, no matter what level you have or you're working with, can teach you something.
Great. Thanks for that, Kim. Hey, Marlena, what about you? Quick answer to your younger self and what you might say.
I would say don't stress out so much about what other people are doing and what the sort of expected career path is. And really, as long as each job, each sort of role that you have, you are learning, you will, one, never be bored, and you'll be okay, you'll be successful in the end.
Fantastic. Hey, Ben, all kidding aside, what about you?
So I'd say I guess it could also be applied to the project, is I found that there are so many great, students out there putting together great work. Don't stress about comparing your work to their work. Compare your work to your work and just compare yourself to yourself. You know what I mean? Just work on improving it, and being transparent and honest with yourself about what you could do to make it better.
Thanks, Ben. That's super thoughtful. Angela, you've come a long way from Shopko. So what about you and the advice you might give your younger self?
I think you all summed up what I was wanting to say, actually. The flexibility in your career, keep an open mind always, be constantly curious, be constantly listening to your customer, and everyone that you work with is your customer. Just be open always humble and make sure that you're enjoying what you're doing.
Fantastic. Thanks, Angela. That was lovely. Thanks to all of you, especially Kim, Angela, Marlena, Ben, and Kristen and SAP for moderating tonight. Anybody who's tuned in, please tune back in next Tuesday for our lunch break with the bosses session. And we hope to see you then. And again, good night, everybody. Thanks for such a productive and thoughtful session. Very much appreciate it.